share. And we are recording. Okay. Well, I guess I have a small group right now, but for the well, I'm not sure. Maybe other people are joining, but we can't see them. Yes, now I see other people are joining.
Where do you see that?
At the bottom of the Zoom window.
Okay.
Below everybody's faces, under participants. We have 8 people in the room right now. So, but it is start time. We have 3 presentations today. There were a couple of other papers that had to be withdrawn because COVID has slowed down research productivity. So we're going to get started with a paper by Eleanor Benami and Robert Halemeyer. And then I'll present, and then Pierre will present. Sure. So thanks for tuning in.
Thanks so much for that introduction. And can everyone see my screen so far? Excellent. So today I'm going to be presenting on some hot off the press work, not actually in press, it's a work in progress, on the producer response to eco-certification, evidence from the quality, quantity, and consistency of Brazilian coffee that I have been working on in conjunction with Robert Halemeyer at UC Santa Barbara. To set out part of the context of the environment in which we're working, coffee is an important crop. Certifications around the globe are increasing, and Brazil matters for both of them. And to be a little bit more explicit about that, coffee serves as the livelihood for about 25 to 125 million people across the globe. 25 for people who are directly involved in production, 125 when you expand that out to their families. About 20 to 40% of all of the areas under coffee production are certified by some form of voluntary sustainability certification, which is exemplified by this graphic over to the right. And of all of the places that produce coffee in the world, Brazil is the single largest producer, and it supplies about 1/3 of the world's coffee in any given year. Today, we're going to be focusing on the intersection of all of these different things and thinking about the micro evidence that's available on some of the responses that that farmers exhibit to a voluntary sustainability certification in the Brazilian Cerrado. To further situate this within some of the academic literature, there's quite a bit of research over the last basically decade that has been focusing in on this question of what evidence exists on the private economic benefits that certification provides. And most of these studies, which have been conducted in a variety of different places across the world, from Kenya to Mexico and in other places within Latin America, have largely shown that this direct benefit of certification is rather limited. There's another strand of literature that's focusing in on ways in which not only can you provide a monetary benefit, but there are ways in which certification can serve as this mechanism to transmit information and help change production patterns themselves. And that can include upgrading processes as well as things like market access. So trying to pick these two things apart, when we think about what farmers' revenues actually look like, what we want to do in this paper today is think a little bit more about this question of both what is this premium, which is often this point 1 here about the direct impacts of certification, and then think about to what extent we might be able to see effects of certification in this production itself and what's very germane to the actual revenues that farmers experience. And I want to focus in a little bit on a recent paper that is relevant to our context here by Machiavelli and Michele Florenza, where they are thinking about the question of a certification program that's trying to improve quality in Colombia. And in their analysis, they do a number of different things. One of the ones that is most closely related to our paper is that they use sales from 2 different years, from 2015 to 2016, from a Colombian cooperative to evaluate the price premia that farmers end up receiving. And from their analysis, they find that farmers who are participating in this Nespresso program receive about 9.6 higher per unit prices across a variety of different model specifications and higher quality across a number of measured dimensions. They also use so this is using kind of a fixed effects panel design, but they also have a spatial spatial discontinuity that they examine, where they're actually looking at upgrading and area expansion, which they also find evidence for within that cooperative. So how this paper is also different is, one, we're looking at a longer time frame. So we are working with a particular cooperative, and we're looking from 2008 to 2019 with before and after transaction information. We also have a different institutional context. It's one of the things that they raise in their paper of how much of the effects they're seeing has to do with this particular feature of a price guarantee, which does not exist here. And this also matters because it so happens that this cooperative is also one of the, and Brazil is one of the largest sources of Nespresso beans. And furthermore, while Nespresso does intersect with our particular context, we are particularly interested in and are focused on the empirics of the additional impact of Rainforest Alliance in particular. And so just to add a little bit more flavor here, Nespresso is not the express focus of our paper, but achieving Nespresso grade quality was a prerequisite of receiving the Rainforest Alliance premium here, which is in function of partnership of these two programs. So just a quick preview of where we're going, so you can be thinking about this and testing against the evidence that we provide throughout the presentation, using a variety of different types of models, including the kind of standard two-way fixed effects model, as well as methods for staggered adoption of treatment over 80,000 transactions from Cerrado farms from 2008 to 2019. We do not have evidence to show that certification generates average revenue changes to farmers. We do have some evidence to suggest that splitting sales and using price hedging instruments such as futures contracts, institutional quirk in our context do appear to have a larger impact on the types of average revenue changes you end up perceiving. And we do also find similarities across the results from this traditional two-way fixed effects model and these staggered adoption estimates and models. And so before I launch into more of the details of this work, it's important to understand a little bit of the basic premise of what certification is. So with certification, you have these farmers who adopt or adhere to a set of practices. They are then monitored and evaluated against those practices. And if they pass those audits, they are eligible to receive a label for their product to distinguish it from other goods to other parts of the supply chain. And so here's an example of 3 different types of certifications. We're focused in on this one here. And while I say that there are many different types of certifications, they vary along a few different types of dimensions, the extent to which they're focused on production and livelihoods versus things like operational sustainability. And as I mentioned before, we're interested in Rainforest Alliance atop Nespresso. Just a little bit more about how these two programs differ. Rainforest Alliance is historically known as being one of the most environmentally rigorous standards. It has an emphasis on conservation and human well-being. This provides some text about how they're really seeking to conserve biodiversity and support sustainable livelihoods by encouraging good agricultural practices, training, and audits. Another point that is worth mentioning for those who are familiar with the different types of variation and certification programs is that there is no price floor. And one of the other prominent papers in this space, which is looking at the impacts of certification on welfare, was thinking about the fair trade context that offers a price floor. This one does not. Another way to contextualize this is when you're thinking about what Rainforest Alliance does as distinct from Nespresso, this here is a select set of indicators that were characterized and quantified by a team out of the University of Münster, who was looking at they created this voluntary coffee standard index, and they were looking across a variety of different environmental as well as social indicators. And you can see here, basically, the larger the number you have, the more stringent it is across these criteria. And you can see from whether it's protecting conservation areas or implementing pest management practices, optimizing the use of fertilizers and beyond, that really Rainforest Alliance is more stringent relative to Nespresso. And suggesting here, and I think the question that we're trying to think about is Rainforest Alliance, even though that has some similarities with Nespresso in many respects, it does require more and has more stringent monitoring standards on top of it. So is there something additional that these farmers are getting from participation that we can observe Or alternatively, can we detect if there's some sort of detrimental effect associated with participating in Rainforest Alliance? Because you can imagine that all of these different exigencies could have an impact on diverting attention from agricultural production to these other types of very socially and environmentally important activities otherwise. So how are we going about trying to address this question? We first are going to be thinking about quality, and just to give you a sense of what that ends up looking like and how it ends up measured. Whenever a farmer ends up delivering a coffee lot to the cooperative, they end up dumping all of their coffee in one place. It ends up being all homogenized together, and then a 2 kilogram sample is extracted and evaluated for its defect rate, its size, its evenness, as well as its sensory attributes like taste and flavor once it's delivered. And so these pictures here are a little bit of a sample from where you can see differences in color, in brokenness, in things like perforations that indicate a particular type of pest infestation. The size, you can see a kind of manual sieve here. There are mechanical operations to also divide out by size. Larger beans tend to be of higher quality. And then here are 2 examples from the partner cooperative that I had been working with. It's a pretty sophisticated operation where they're weighing everything out and going through and sampling coffee with multiple people evaluating those sensory dimensions. And for those varying gradations in quality, there are also gradations in prices that farmers will end up receiving. And so here is a chart that characterizes a variety of different quality codes that farmers within our data set actually received. And you can see variation both within these different quality grades as in any given year, as well as variation over time. And part of that is a reflection of the quality codes. Part of that might also be international exchange rates that also vary during this time too. Now, thinking about all of these different things together and to be a bit more explicit, how can certification intersect with coffee quantity and quality, and how would that then propagate to what the prices are that they would end up receiving? So there are 4 main things that end up affecting quantity and quality. One of them is the selection of your particular variety. There's a series of environmental conditions, and particularly things like temperature stress or water stress. There are farm management practices. And you can see here in this example, this is actually somewhat emblematic of this environment that we're dealing with. These are full sun operations where mechanization is also quite prominent. And then post-harvest practices. And so how are you storing things so you avoid mold, for example, and ensuring that you separate out your coffee. And so why would you also think that there might be some way through which certification ends up influencing coffee bean production? You could think that if something were already profitable, then why wouldn't these, if it were already profitable, then these farmers might already be doing it. And there's 2 main mechanisms that we posit in this paper that could be at play and why certification might have an additional impact. One is what we term this management effect, where you can imagine that certification is playing this role of addressing some information gaps via these peer sharing networks that are put in place for certification, as well as the additional training that comes along with them. Of particular note, in this case, is integrated pest management, in part because starting in 2012, this southeastern region of Brazil entered into a multi-year drought. Water and temperature stress, they can directly affect plant yields, and they can also directly affect quality themselves. Similarly, cover crop management and post-harvest practices that are encouraged through certification could end up having an impact. In addition, there's this element of certification, Rainforest Alliance certification, coming along with a higher monitoring requirement. And this could have a number of different channels through which it ends up affecting production itself. One is you can think that through this process of consistent record keeping and monitoring, one, you see that farmers may actually change their behavior when they're observed. This is consistent with an idea of a Hawthorne effect. Second, you might also think that as these farmers are assembling all of this information and having to produce that, this closer familiarity with what's going on could actually help them identify anomalies. And then finally, there are some commitment devices to maybe things you might have wanted to do on your farms, but were otherwise less incentivized to do it because nobody was looking over your shoulder to actually make sure that it ended up happening. So what are the data and methods that we use in our context to assess this question? We are looking at an area of about 150 by 300 kilometers. We have about 82,000 transactions, about which 20% of them are certified from about 505 farm plots. On these farm plots, we have information about all of the deliveries that were sold at a given quality grade. So that includes the amount per quality grade, which we also convert into the share that is classified by the cooperative into this high quality tier, the price that is received at the time of the transaction, the premium that is received for the amount that is delivered, and then the share that's also sold with some futures contract. We also have information on certification dates. And I'll note here that we're taking this model of exposure to certification so that once a farm plot enters into certification, it is coded as in certification from there on out. And then another point to note is because certification is done at the plot level, we also aggregate these variables to the plot level itself. Oh dear. Okay, there we go. And as a rough point of comparison about what size we're looking at here, 150 by 300 kilometers is roughly about the size of the state of Maryland. So what do we use as some of our key models here? I reckon most of you all are quite familiar with the two-way fixed effects models that have some pretty strong assumptions around homogeneity of constant treatment effects and homogeneity of those effects over time. So we also employ a variety of other different types of models that account for staggered adoption and use a different weighting of controls to examine the robustness of the results that we end up finding. So to kick off with what we're seeing on the revenue impact of certification using this two-way fixed effects approach and clustered farmer standard errors, we first see that we don't end up seeing any impact from certification on revenues or quantity. We do see this model would be suggestive of some small effect from reducing the average price of quality. But again, that's swamped by the time you get out to revenues, since quality and quantity are basically summative for revenues here. We also see some relationship in between the share of sales with futures contracts, and that resulting in approximately a 3% higher average price for the 3% higher price average price per unit price. And then the number of plot sales per year also seems to be correspond with roughly 3 to 4% change in the average revenues that we end up seeing within each farm plot. Yet that kind of model doesn't necessarily account for the fact that we have this staggered adoption design. And so here I wanted to share a little bit about the certification dynamics for these 98 farms that end up certified throughout this time period. You see that the first set come in 2010, and we have a large increase in certified farmers in 2011 and 2013, and some increases throughout this entire time period. So to think a little bit more about how these types of cohorts of farmers might end up having differential patterns, we look and employ the Callaway Santana approach to thinking about heterogeneity. So here, this is to show you a little bit of an example of what's going on. If you think about each of these groups of farmers as a different cohort, you can examine what are their average treatment effects within any given time period. And so where the red here indicates what the pre-treatment period is, and the blue indicates once they've actually entered into certification, we see in most cases there's no difference from zero prior to treatment, and that in the post-treatment and the post-treatment period in blue. Although we do see, interestingly, some variation from year to year in the overall revenues, which again I think is a function of quantity of production in this environment, and that's kind of consistent with this biennial production pattern that's exhibited in this context across a few different cohorts. So that's one way of thinking, just to decompose that a little bit and thinking about what's going on within each particular cohort. And then if you end up grouping these cohorts together to actually say, well, what is the average treatment effect across that entire set and not just year by year, we end up here also seeing that if you want to aggregate across those, we cannot reject the null that there are differences across these groups, across any of the outcome variables that we're looking at, again, with revenue, quality, as indicated by the average unit price or quantity. And here, just to stack the estimates against one another from our two-way fixed effects model and these average treatment effect on the treated from the Callaway Santana models, we see that they're generally consistent, but in this heterogeneous impact model, we cannot reject declining quality as reflected in average prices either. You might also think, not only would you want to think about it in a cohort-based way, but maybe you think that we can consider the length of exposure and think about it more in event study time. And also in this context, across these same variables and one additional variable that's thinking about high quality sales, again, that high quality tier that we discussed before, we also cannot reject the null that there are differences in between these groups. And then if you're not satisfied by any of those, you can further take a variety of, change around a variety of different things, both the model structure, think about a different series of controls that we end up putting in place. So including the shares of futures contracts, the total number of sales, the quality in the pre-treatment period, the price in the treatment period, revenue, volume, also the estimation methods that are employed, the sample that we end up using, again, focusing in potentially on those years that have the highest amount of variation, and then also thinking about different types of controls, whether we're comparing against the farms that are never treated or those that are yet to be treated. And across all of these specifications, we end up finding that we cannot rule out the null hypothesis, that there's no difference in between the groups. And here where the dependent variable is focused in on log revenues, although there is some wide variation among individual experiences. So in summary, what this analysis so far suggests to us is that perhaps sales structure, so things like splitting sales and futures contracts, could potentially influence some of the prices received. That's why we incorporated them into some of the earlier models and is potentially worthy of further investigation for thinking about that outcome of what happens with farmers and farmer welfare. But across all model specifications, sample splits, and estimation techniques, we cannot reject the null hypothesis of differences in average or total revenues between these certified and non-certified samples. Although again, asterisk here because there's some wide variation in individual experiences that we're also examining further. And just to give you a sneak peek and a preview of some of the things that we've been thinking about as we're moving forward. So one of the things that I had mentioned at the very beginning is thinking about not just how much are we observing changes in production itself, but also stacking that up against what are the premia that farmers are actually receiving. And so here, apologize that this is a little small, but we see that when you take the amount that farmers receive as a premium for participation in certification, and you compare that to the amount of, or the value of their total production, we end up seeing from year to year, from at least 2015 onwards, where we have data on this, anywhere from 2 to about 8% of the total value comes through this certification participation. So we're thinking about this a little bit more and how we can characterize and contrast these values a little bit as we move forward. An important additional point as we're thinking about what are these mechanisms is, as I mentioned before, there was a period of high temperature and low precipitation environments that were very conducive for buggy conditions. And so thinking about how we might want to potentially interact weather and explore some of that heterogeneity, given that there's such wide variation in outcomes, is something that we're considering, as well as how we better account for the biennial production patterns that exist in this environment. In some ways, it might make you think that, maybe event study time doesn't quite make the most sense in this context, and rather thinking about cohorts would, if you end up really seeing up and down years and they're moving consistently in the same direction. But we'll be exploring that. And then as kind of one meta thought as we're thinking about this incentive structure for certification, of course, earlier in the presentation, I had been mentioning that we are interested in what is the impact of the certification on revenues, which is a function of production and premia. But there's another really important part here and component that factors into the profit function, which is the costs, including the cost to just participate in the program, as well as the cost of compliance actions. I mean, something that is actually kind of nice in this context is a lot of folks do tend to think that while there are some differences in the types of requirements that Rainforest Alliance has, in some ways, compared with Nespresso is in some ways could be seen as like a stepping stone in that direction. So in some ways, maybe the fact that we're layering this on top of Nespresso means that the costs are relatively limited to get into Rainforest Alliance. Certainly some of my field experiences interviewing over 100 of these farmers suggested that we, for those who ended up participating in group certification, the costs that they ended up noting over time ended up being pretty minimal. So that's another area that we're thinking about, and that's just on the private producer side and the private benefits that they accrue. But as we're thinking about certification, private profits are just but one part of this social cost and benefit function. And there's some emerging literature that also suggests that certification can have an important impact on social and environmental attributes, as would be indicated in the types of things that they require. And so there could be another way of thinking about what is the type of premium that would be appropriate to account for those conditions and changes. So I'll pause there. Thank you all for your time, and I look forward to hearing more of your questions.
Thanks, Eleanor. So as I put into the chat window, if you have any questions for us at any point, please use the Q&A feature of the Zoom webinar. I don't think that the participants are allowed to speak.
I had a question for Eleanor.
Yes, I was hoping you would.
Do you think that there could be an effect on market access from certification? Could it be that, in fact, if you have certification, you have an easier time finding a buyer? And could it be that you don't observe that some of the plots actually don't sell, or that it takes so much more time to sell, and that would be a benefit from certification?
That's an excellent question, and that was something that just this past weekend I was thinking about a little bit more and how we might be able to disentangle that. So it does turn out that this cooperative does have information on both deliveries as well as sales. And so one of the next steps that I'm also thinking about is, can we look at the differences in between basically time to sale and what ends up not being sold, and if that gives us some indication from that cooperative side. There's also a world where I mean, what is nice about the Columbia paper and what they were able to do is, I think at least in 1 year, they had information across all transactions and were able to see that there was fairly, or ascertain that there was fairly limited side selling that was occurring. In this context, I think the ways, there's one other dimension that I like to add there, which is in some of the field interviews that I had done, the estimates I ended up getting for the amount that farmers ended up sending to this cooperative is around 80 to 100%. So I think we are less constrained on that would give me confidence at least that we're observing a lot of the production that these farmers end up actually having here. But it is a question of what they end up delivering to the cooperative. Can we then pick apart what gets sold and how quickly? So great question, thinking about it and want to incorporate it into the next version.
So I have a question too, Eleanor, and this is a fairly simple question, but what was the discrepancy between the estimates when you used the Callaway and Santana model versus breaking it down by cohort?
Great question. So let's go back to, where did I put that? Let me see if I can, maybe just like flicking through the slides will take me there. Oh, can I do that? Previous, haha, okay. Here. So here, I I think the estimates ended up being broadly, directionally similar. So average treatment effects on revenue. So again, not exactly the same, but moving in the same direction. Quality, this also ends up being negative, but not significantly so. And quantity also broadly similar.
And just to add to that, one thing that we know, I mean, since a lot of these results were null results and quite close to zero, when you're thinking about the difference between the two-way fixed effects and the Callaway Santana approach, like there you're kind of expecting, you're adjusting for heterogeneity in kind of treatment timing dynamics or across cohorts. And since we were finding pretty null results across all of those, the kind of aggregation method didn't seem to matter as much. So a lot of the specifications that we were running through, you wouldn't actually, I think in the end, expect to see much of a difference between those estimation approaches. And that's largely what we confirmed with the analysis.
Okay, thanks.
And in case people need more time to think about questions and want to reach back out, that's also fine too. My email address is I think publicly available, and I'm happy to take questions also offline as we continue. And
you can also ask some questions at the end, because I think we will have time after all three presentations. So thanks, Elma and Robert. Right. So as I said at the beginning, we only have 3 presentations today, and I will be going next, and Pierre will be going third, and I'm gonna share my screen now. Can everybody see this? Just a sec. You can see it. Now I can see it too. Okay. So this paper is about moral hazard, or it's called Moral Hazard Under Discrete Information Disclosure, Evidence from Food Safety Inspections. I'm going to give you a pretty detailed background on the program that I'm analyzing some of the incentives around, and then I'll talk with you about data and hypothesis testing for different hypotheses. So the background is that Salmonella in poultry is a somewhat costly public health issue in the United States. It could perhaps be associated with up to $3 billion a year in public health costs, but that's kind of an upper bound on the estimates based on the epidemiological literature and cost of illness literature. There's a lot of variation in estimates on how many people get sick from foodborne pathogens. But the USDA has an agency called the Food Safety and Inspection Service, FSIS, which has been running a so-called Salmonella verification testing program for broilers, that is meat chickens, since 1999. And the way that this program works is that they randomly take one chicken carcass off the processing line at each chicken slaughter establishment that's federally inspected. No more than one per day, and only a limited number in a year. For most of the program, less than 30 per establishment per year. Again, these establishments are chicken slaughter establishments, slaughterhouses. And in this paper, I have data from 1999 to 2018, and I look at a series of 4 policy changes that took place over that period. In the first policy change, FSIS began to categorize establishments based on their performance on these Salmonella tests. Then, starting in 2008 and continuing through to the present, the category status of the worst performing establishments is publicly disclosed on an FSIS website. And then subsequent changes to the categorization procedure were made in 2011 and 2015. And as I said, I will be spending a lot of time talking about the background, so I'm going to get into the details more. So the categorization is determined through, or has always been determined on the basis of the number of positive samples, either within a so-called sample set or a sampling window. Up until 2015, the categorization was made on the basis of 51 sampled carcasses. And that's somewhat arbitrary, but again, they would take no more than one chicken off the line per day. They were supposed to be doing it on consecutive operating days. So basically they were sampling one chicken per day for about 2 months and then not sampling any more chickens for the purpose of testing for Salmonella under this particular program up until 2015. So you can see that firms would have had a lot of incentives not to pay attention to Salmonella during the other 10 months of the year, or even longer than that, because there may have been some years where they weren't inspected at all for the sake of this program. So then in 2015, FSIS decided to replace those 51 sample sets with rolling 52-week windows. So they would sample approximately one chicken per week, and assign categorization based on performance over 52-week windows. I'll talk more about that again in a few minutes. So now I'm going to talk about my hypotheses for a few minutes. Again, this paper is about moral hazard in the context of this FSIS inspection program. We would expect to see establishment operators reduce their efforts around Salmonella control in at least 3 cases. First, when an establishment has been doing poorly and they therefore exceed the public disclosure threshold before the end of the sample set. Second, when they've had very few positive samples and it would therefore be impossible to exceed the threshold. So in either of these first 2 cases, the categorization wouldn't depend on how well they did for the rest of the sample set. In the first case, they've done so poorly, even if they have 0 positive samples for the rest of the sample set, they'll still be categorized a certain way. In the other case, if they've done very well, they could have 100% positive samples for the rest of this sample set or sampling window, and they would still be categorized in the same way. So again, for the sake of this program, they have very, very low incentives for controlling Salmonella. The third time when we'd expect to see them reducing efforts around Salmonella control is when categorization is not yet determined, but there's more leeway with respect to the thresholds that would move them into a new worse category. The second type of hypothesis that I look at is building on a paper that I published with Mike Ollinger last year in AAEA, where we found that the initial changes to this program helped to improve Salmonella test performance of the industry, of establishments in the industry. And so I look at that again using this new, longer and more refined data set. And then the third hypothesis, which is not in the working paper that's available online, but I will talk about it for a few minutes, is about intra-firm spillovers. So what happens when one establishment within a firm exceeds a threshold? Then I hypothesize that other establishments within a firm may either compensate, that is, improve their performance to make sure that at least one of the establishments within the firm is performing according to the better categorization standard. Or we may see them shirking or reducing effort if, for some reason, buyers are going to be avoiding any firm that has a single establishment that's above a given threshold. And I also note that shirking could also be a response to good performance by other establishments within a firm, which is kind of like negative compensation. Okay. So I use a few different approaches here to test the various hypotheses. First, an RD approach to examine the effects of crossing the category thresholds on subsequent Salmonella test performance. I also use essentially the same model to examine the intra-firm spillovers. Then I use OLS with establishment month-year fixed effects to show the correlation between leeway and subsequent test performance. And lastly, I use RD and time to study the effects of the entire series of policy changes. So again, I'm going to spend several more minutes talking about the background of the program, because I think that without doing that, the results may not make much sense. So again, there were 4 policy changes during the period that I have data for. Up until 2006, FSIS was conducting these tests, and they were assigning, there was a single standard. There were not categories. There was a single binary standard, and it was very generous. So if an establishment had more than 13 positive samples out of the 51 sample set, 13 or more, then they would be considered to have failed the standard, and there were some minor sanctions imposed, and that's it. But there was no public information about this this failure. Again, starting in 2006, they introduced the notion of a category system. So category 1 establishments were those that had 6 or fewer positive samples out of 51. Category 2 were those that had 7 to 12, and category 3 was 13 or more. And then in 2008, the category information was made public when an establishment was in either category 2 or 3. Their name was placed on the FSIS website, their name and an address. I think that's all the information that's there. They were placed on this FSIS website, and then the name would remain there until the next sample set was complete. So it could be a year or 2 before they were removed, even if they improved their performance much more quickly than that. And then in 2011, the standard was tightened so that an establishment needed to have 2 or fewer positives out of 51 to be in category 1, 3 to 5 to be in category 2, and then 6 or more, they would be in category 3, but only the names and addresses of category 3 establishments were posted online starting in 2011. And then lastly, in 2015, as I said a few minutes ago, these sample sets were eliminated and replaced with these rolling windows. So the categorization was still done according to the same percentages as in the 2011 to 15 period, but it was based on performance over 52 weeks. It could have, the denominator could be somewhat lower or somewhat higher than 51. And then it was also a little bit more stringent in the sense that, if they had a single failure, a single result over 5 out of 51 in the last 3 months, then they would be considered category 3, and their name and address would be posted on the FSIS website. So they had roughly 13, there were roughly 13 52-week windows ending in each 3-month period. And there were basically a lot more opportunities for failure. Sorry, I've been distracted for the last minute because I realize as I'm going through these details about the background that I can't see the Q&A part of the Zoom meeting. So if one of the other presenters would let me know if there are any questions. Thanks. Okay, so my data, I submitted a FOIA request and got the data through that. I got all carcass level test results from the Salmonella verification testing program for broilers. Again, that's meat chickens from the beginning of the program until January 2018. It's about 173,000 observations, as I said, about 9,000 observations per year. There are very few covariates in the data set, and none of them are time varying. And there's also no information on sample set assignment. So I had to impute the assignment of the observations into sample sets. And basically the procedure I used was to identify lengthy gaps between observations at each establishment and assign provisional sample sets. And then I dropped those that had many more or many fewer than 51 observations. I think that the observations that I've kept are very accurately assigned into sample sets. But I'm not using all of those 172,000 observations. And then this graph summarizes the monthly average Salmonella test results over all firms in the industry. Again, these are the inspected firms, the federally inspected firms. You can see that around 2005, when the first change was made to introduce the categories, the average, on average, nearly 20% of chickens tested that were sampled under this program tested positive for Salmonella. And that rate fell quite significantly until around 2016. But technology was improving, so genetic information could be obtained more quickly, and outbreaks could be traced to their source much more easily over the last couple of decades. There's definitely improvements along those lines, and also buyer standards may have been changing. So buyers may have been demanding much better rates on either the federal Salmonella tests or or they may have been requiring private testing be done. So those could also be driving the changes, not just the FSIS testing program and its changes. Sorry. Okay, so I have, again, several sets of hypotheses tests. Again, the first is about the effects of known categorization on Salmonella test outcomes. This is where I use a regression discontinuity approach with leeway as the running variable. Here I define the variable leeway C as the share of remaining samples within the sample set that may test positive if the total number of positives is going to be remaining at or below any of the critical thresholds that determine categorization. The rest of the math at the bottom of the screen, I think, is not necessary for understanding this intuitive definition of leeway. The share of remaining samples that may test positive. If the firm is going to stay in the same category, establishment is going to stay in the same category as their current results suggest. And I hope that this diagram also helps to develop some of the intuition. So on the vertical axis, I have Salmonella control efforts. My hypothesis is that when the value of this leeway variable is greater than or equal to 1 or less than 0, their efforts related to controlling Salmonella are going to drop substantially. Again, if leeway is greater than or equal to 1, that means 100% of their remaining samples may test positive and their categorization will be unaffected. And similarly, over here, even if all of their remaining samples are negative, they will still be categorized the same way if their leeway value is less than 0. So these are the two critical thresholds in the regression discontinuity approach that I use. This slide has a lot of detail. I'm not going to read through all of it, but I follow Cataneo et al., who have a couple of monographs on RD approaches, and they recommend using the method that I've used here, sharp RD analysis with local linear regressions, and a number of other details are specified on the screen. Again, there are two cutoffs here. When leeway is greater than or equal to 0, and when leeway is greater than or equal to 1. Those are my two cutoffs. So it's recommended strongly that any RD approach do a couple of tests to make sure that the running variable cannot be manipulated. If the running variable can be manipulated, that would suggest that the variation around the cutoffs is not random. So these manipulability tests are recommended. First, the density test of the running variable, which I think dates back to McCrary 2008. And second, to run an RD model on baseline covariates to demonstrate that the baseline covariates are randomly distributed around the cutoffs. Unfortunately, neither test supports the null hypothesis in my data set. And my running variable is somewhat unusual, I guess, in that it's very, very lumpy with some values. Again, this is the leeway variable, some values like 0 and 1, and to a lesser extent, any fraction with a small denominator like 1/2, 1/3, 1/4 are going to be, these are going to be much more common than, say, the leeway value of 1/29. So what I do to reassure myself about the validity of the RD approach is to simulate a Bernoulli distribution with the same mean values as in my real data sets. And this simulated random data demonstrates, well, it's actually more lumpy than the real data are. So, and also obviously fails the density test. So I would suggest that while my data do not meet the classical criteria, there's also not evidence of manipulation. Similarly, the RD coefficients are estimated to be significant for some of the baseline covariates that I have, but that's also true for many of the placebo cutoffs. And to get around this potential objection, I need to simply argue that manipulation is unlikely because agents, that is both establishment operators and inspectors, cannot determine the value of leeway with extreme precision. And last, to establish the validity of the RD design, I present these histograms. If there was manipulation, we would expect to see the total number of positive samples in each policy period to be just below the threshold to avoid disclosure, or below the threshold that would trigger disclosure. Triggering disclosure is on the right side of the red lines in certain cases here, and we don't see bunching taking place right at the threshold. So I hope that my RD approach seems convincing. And I don't have time, since I've spent so much time on background, to get into the results of the RD analysis in great detail. I just have one summary slide. I find that when establishments fail to meet thresholds that do not subject them to public disclosure, their rate of Salmonella, positive Salmonella test results increases by about 3 to 9 percentage points. On the other hand, I find that when establishments fail to meet thresholds that do subject them to public disclosure, there's no statistically significant change in test performance. And third, I find that establishments' test performance only worsened after they had had sustained good performance that ensured they would avoid disclosure in one case, which is ironically the period 2015 to 2018 when the sample sets were eliminated to try to combat moral hazard. And then I have, as I alluded to, I have some preliminary results on intra-firm spillovers. So what happens when the best performing firm in the establishment crosses the leeway equals 1 value, or when the worst performing firm in the establishment in the firm crosses the leeway equals 0 threshold. Here I find these are the significant results. From in the initial period before categorization, I find a 2 percentage point increase in the likelihood of positive samples when the best performing other establishment within the same firm becomes certain to meet the regulatory standard. So that is some slight evidence of shirking during that period. And then I find this really huge result, which is hard to believe, frankly. I need to go back and see what's really happening here. A 69 percentage point increase in the likelihood of positive samples when the worst performing establishment within the same firm becomes certain to fail to meet the category 2 standard. So that's, again, really, really tremendous increase and very suggestive of shirking. Again, it's just we're looking at the results or the leeway value for the worst performing establishment within the firm, and it's a narrow window around that leeway equals 0 threshold. But we do see this really shocking evidence of shirking in that case. And then from 2011 to 2015, when they were only disclosing category 3 firms based on sample sets, I find a 20 percentage point decrease in the likelihood of positive samples when the worst performing establishment within the same firm becomes certain to fail to meet the category 1 standard, which is evidence of compensation. But interestingly, all of these significant findings are discontinuities based on information that's conveyed only privately to slaughter firms. So, the first two, obviously there was no disclosure. In the third, I'm looking at, that result is for crossing the category 1 threshold and becoming category 2. And at that time, category 2 establishment's information was not disclosed. So that's interesting, and it's actually fairly consistent with the other shirking behavior that I was talking about a few minutes ago. Now, the caveat is that these results are, one caveat is that the results are preliminary because I've assigned establishments to firms based on the establishment names either at the time the data set was pulled in 2018 or at the time federal inspection ceased. Okay. So moving on to the second set of hypothesis tests, I look again at proximity to the regulatory thresholds and Salmonella test outcomes. Again, this diagram should motivate the approach. When we're between the leeway equals 0 and leeway equals 1 limits, we would expect to see some decrease in effort as leeway increases. And that's I hope, fairly intuitive. If they have more potential opportunities to fail, more potential positives, they will be putting in less effort. And so here I use linear probability models with the dependent variable being test outcomes for individual carcasses and the key explanatory variable being leeway. The identification strategy is not too strong here well, it's not an RD or a DD approach. But I think that there's pretty strong evidence of a causal relationship because none of the regressors can be precisely controlled by the regulated entity, and clearly temporally the outcome variable cannot affect any of the regressors. And again, I don't have time to go through all the results in detail, but here are the results. Here's my summary of the results. The proximity to threshold matters in almost all cases across looking at different thresholds across all time periods. The relationship tends to be stronger when the threshold is in fact associated with public disclosure. And here I summarize the results when we're talking about a public disclosure threshold. So using leeway value of 10 percentage points as the unit, when the value of leeway increases by 10 percentage points, the likelihood of a positive sample increases by between 1 and 4 percentage points, depending on the period. Again, this is just looking at the 4 cases when one of these, where the threshold triggered public disclosure. And lastly, I look at the effects of policy changes on average Salmonella test outcomes, the series of policy changes. So this uses an RD and time approach, and I recommend referencing Hausman and Rapson 2018 paper in Annual Review of Resource Economics if you're interested in using this kind of approach. As I said, this part of the paper builds on Allender and Bove 2020. In that paper, we found that the introduction of categorization in 2006 reduced the rate of positive Salmonella samples by 6 to 10 percentage points, and then the introduction of disclosure in 2008 reduced positive samples by 3 to 5 percentage points across the industry. In that paper, we used annual average test results by establishment, but we had more covariates available. Sorry, just my words. So again, I use a sharp RD analysis according to the approach recommended by Catneo and co-authors. And my cutoffs, so the running variable is time, date, and the cutoffs are the 4 dates when the policy changed in 2006, 08, 2011, and 15. You can see the day of the year here. So in panel A, I've included all establishments, and you can see that only one of the results here is significant. We saw a 5.1 percentage point decrease in the rate of positive Salmonella samples when public disclosure was implemented. But there could be some bias introduced, and that bias may be running in either direction if we include all establishments, because I didn't really talk about it, but roughly a quarter of the chicken slaughter establishments exited the industry over this 20-year period. And if exit is correlated with poor food safety outcomes or Salmonella test outcomes, but it's not directly tied to these policy changes around categorization and public disclosure, we may see some bias. And what we're really interested in, of course, is the effects of the policy changes on the firms that remained in the industry, both before and after the policy changed, because, as I said, there's the possibility that some of the firms that exited had, well, I mean, empirically, they had worse food safety performance, and that, but estimating a strong improvement in food safety outcomes after the policy changed, because some of the firms left, but they exited not precisely because of the policy change. Well, that's not exactly the effect that we would want to be estimating. So you see that when I exclude the firms that ever exited, this policy change in 2011 has a strong significant effect. It's actually a 7 percentage point increase in the rate of positive Salmonella samples after that 2011 tightening of the standard. The effect in 2008 remains about the same. And so to, that's not an intuitive result. And to explore that result, that positive coefficient in 2011 a little bit more, I break down the data set based on performance, the average performance of the establishment in the period immediately preceding the policy change. I'm just going to talk about the results here for 2011. You see that the tightening of standards decreased the rate of positive Salmonella samples by about 4% for those firms that would have been category 2 based on their performance in the 3 years prior to this policy change. But there was an 18 percentage point increase in the rate of positive samples for those firms that would have been category 3 based on the 2011 standard. So that's very strong evidence that they gave up with respect to trying to meet, or many of the firms gave up with respect to trying to meet the new, more stringent standards that were in place starting in July 1st, 2011. And this is just a quick summary of those RD and time results. Again, I find that the introduction of public disclosure across many specifications, which I haven't shown you the results of here, reduced the rate of positive Salmonella samples by about 4 to 6 percentage points, which is consistent with my earlier paper. The tightening of standards in 2011, however, increased the rate of positive samples by 6 to 13 percentage points, which is actually more than double compared with the baseline. Again, when I control for establishments that exit the industry, and again, that's driven by the increase in the rate of positive Salmonella samples among the worst performing establishments. And the other two policy changes essentially negated each other and were significant in only 1 or 2 of the several specifications that I ran. So in summary, again, looking at moral hazard, I find that when establishments fail to meet thresholds that do not subject them to public disclosure, their rate of positive Salmonella test results increases by between 3 and 9 percentage points. And I only find one instance where, evidence of moral hazard where the establishment had previously had good test performance, and this would ensure that they would avoid public disclosure. Only one instance where there's moral hazard in that good performance. I do find this, again, preliminary evidence on intra-firm spillovers having very strong effects on shirking and compensation to a lesser extent. In the third analysis, I find that proximity to thresholds nearly always matters, and that the effects are stronger when the threshold is associated with public disclosure. And again, I find that the public disclosure in 2008 reduced the rate of positive samples by 4 to 6 percentage points. But overall, looking at the series of 4 policy changes, these 4 policy changes essentially negated each other, or even resulted in a net increase in positive samples across the 4 policy changes. Looking at the RD in time windows, which are narrow windows around the 4 dates of policy change. So I think I have about 15 minutes. I've given myself about 15 minutes for questions. I'd love to get some feedback. Thank you. And for some reason, I'm not seeing the Q&A part of the screen.
So John, I think I see that there's no questions on the Q&A. Okay. Maybe someone else can confirm that. just to start off, I have a question for you regarding your interpretation for shirking.
Mhm.
I forgot already all the controls that you include for that. So my question may be a little naive. Could it be that firms, or sorry, establishments that belong to a given firm are close geographically and that they procure chicken in the same area? And could it be that what you call shirking is just that there's some kind of contamination from the farms? Because not everything happens at the slaughtering house. I imagine that the salmonella is already here in the chicken. So could it be that they're just procuring from the same area and there's been an outbreak, and what you call shirking could be just broader contamination?
Yeah, that's a great question, Pierre. Thank you. It's something that I hadn't thought about before. I have thought about trying to control for geography in some of the work that I'm hoping to do over the coming months. And I also have to understand, I need to educate myself a little bit more on the biology of it, because I believe that Salmonella is present in a very large share of chickens in their guts. And so I'm not sure how much can be done to control it on the farm when we're talking about meat chickens.
I see.
So, but I need to look into it and be a little bit more sure of that answer. Yes, definitely many of the firms that have multiple establishments, they're pretty concentrated, and actually, like, the whole industry is reasonably concentrated in the South, like Georgia and Alabama. I'm not sure the exact number that's in those two states, but it's something, maybe 15%. So fairly concentrated geographically, both within and across firms. So yeah, I'll look into that.
And following up on the spillovers analysis, I'm curious,
Mhm.
I might have overlooked or kind of missed this, but what's the institutional argument why you would expect kind of an increase in shirking as soon as a firm that kind of belong, or another facility that belongs to the same firm has crossed that threshold?
Well, so I guess I didn't spend enough time talking about it, but I think the explanation for a lot of the results in my paper is that private buyer standards for various quality attributes in chicken, including salmonella, are more stringent than the federal government standards. And so my suggestion is that the incentives are sort of more about the meta reputation of the firm, and not about whether they're on this list, which is public information. But maybe it's more about just to pick, say if John's Chicken Company has 3 plants, and one of them appears on the category 3 list, then maybe my buyer doesn't want to work with me anymore, even if I can assure him or her that my other 2 plants are under the limit, because they might say, well, what controls are in place to make sure that you are in fact under the limit in your other plants. And especially when you think about the program in terms of, well, they were only sampling maybe 2 months worth of a year's supply of chickens. What assurances are in place for the other 10 months of the year? So that's, I hope, hinting at some of the institutional reasons that we might see shirking when one establishment of the firm crosses a threshold. So? Yeah, I mean, I see you nodding, Robert. Did you want to follow up on any of that?
No, that sounds reasonable. I think that having that context and understanding kind of the combination of private and kind of public penalties that are coming from the disclosure, and really unpacking kind of the public disclosure versus the kind of public penalties that are being applied at these different, it's a complex system. And maybe you could even use the kind of different waves to actually try and distinguish that I think in some periods, maybe you wouldn't expect that explanation of shirking to actually hold when there isn't kind of public disclosure, whereas in other periods it would. And so maybe you could use that to actually test that as the mechanism that's driving this behavior.
Yeah, I think so. Thanks for bringing that up.
And more broadly, I think, there might be some, I haven't really fully thought through this, but there might be some interesting opportunities. You kind of broke the empirical part of the talk into 3 pieces.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like maybe there's some opportunity to bring the first and the third piece together through some kind of difference in discontinuities analysis, that you're actually looking at whether there's this kind of sudden shift at the threshold when a new threshold has been introduced.
Yeah.
And maybe that's already in the empirical specification and I just missed it, but I think
it's not. Thanks, Robert. I wanted to do that, but I wanted, so difference in discontinuities is like RDD, right? I mean, like difference in differences with a regression discontinuity, RDDD.
Exactly. So your kind of running variable when you were using the, and I already forgot the term you were using, but
leeway.
Yeah, the leeway running variable and how that kind of changes as the running variable shifts through time.
Yeah, so that was the approach I originally wanted to take. But I couldn't really justify parallel trends. And I know that there have been some developments where you can maybe use a DD approach without parallel trends. But as I mentioned, I don't really have any covariates in my data set either. So basically I had to settle on just using RD and looking at the individual time periods as distinct experiments, or, just I can't really integrate the analysis in that way across the periods, the way I've been thinking about it so far, but maybe I'm missing something. Thanks. Are there any other questions or comments?
Could you speak a little bit more about this exit
Yeah.
question? I guess and maybe if I can test out my interpretation of what you had said, when you have one story that could emerge is when you have these firms that are exiting, is there some sort of like scale issue that might be happening? So you have a certain number of chickens that need to be processed, and you have some firms that end up exiting, and then all of these other firms end up absorbing the amount of chickens that have to be slaughtered, and they can't manage that so quickly, and so you end up just by virtue of needing to scale up quickly are unable to manage that from a basically like process managerial perspective. Like, is that something that's feasible that could be going on within your context?
Yeah, definitely. Let me just write this down real quick in my notes. So yes, I think that could have really, that could change the way that the chickens are distributed in a big way. I don't really know too much about where the chickens were going, and I guess, in some ways that might be a different paper. Thinking about the geographical connections between the farms and the various slaughter establishments, and also thinking about the closure having effects within the same firm and potentially diverting chickens across firms. Of course, agricultural people who took their PhD courses in an ag econ department with the ag econ field, like I did, trying to be careful here, are aware that chicken companies are very, very highly vertically integrated. So, like Tyson's, if they close 2 plants, those chickens aren't going to go over to Purdue. They're just going to continue working with, the same farms are going to continue to supply other Tyson's plants. So that's one aspect of this industry. The other is, there could be food safety implications. And it's worth looking at the geographic connections between closure and like nearby food safety outcomes after closures. But in terms of like, I don't have information about the actual scale, how many chickens are being slaughtered by each establishment. So that's something that would be missing from any kind of analysis. But I think it's a great suggestion, and I'd love to look into it if I can. I'm not sure exactly what I would need for that, but I think it's definitely time to turn it over to Pia. I think I've probably been on the screen for more than 40 minutes. So thank you all for your suggestions. And again, thank you to those of you who tuned in for our smaller panel this afternoon. I'll give it over to Pierre. Thanks.
Thanks, John. As I'm trying to share my screen, I have another question for you. Is there any seasonality in the positivity rate that you have?
I've not looked at it, but it's a great question.
And then another thought, do firms tend to shirk prior to closure of an establishment?
I did look into that, and I didn't find any obvious evidence of it. And I wasn't really confident enough in my empirical approach on that question to include it in the paper. But yeah, thanks for asking about it.
Okay, can you all see my presentation? The first slide? Yes. Okay.
Yes.
So I'm presenting on lemons and wines, and I'm glad that my two co-authors are part of the session. Ariel Ortiz from Cornell and Emmanuel Paroissien from INRA in France. I am myself in France right now. I'm starting a 6-month sabbatical. So that's a good way to start it, is to present this paper about wines. So in this paper, we're trying to answer a big question, but we're going to look at a particular setting. And this question is about the welfare significance of what we call the lemons problem after Akerlof's famed paper in the QJ in 1970. In this paper, Akerlof develops a kind of a theoretical framework whereby he shows that in the presence of asymmetric information, and his example is used cars, where sellers have more information about the quality of the car than potential buyers, there could be potentially large welfare losses arising from buyers not knowing the quality of a particular car. And in the strongest form, the welfare loss can be quite big because the bad product drives out the good product. And in the end, you have what we call an unraveling of the market, whereby only the product of lowest quality is exchanged in equilibrium. After that contribution, several empirical pieces have tried first to find evidence of this lemons effect. And more recently, in particular in the insurance literature, economists have tried to measure the welfare significance of this effect. Is it something that we should be worried about? How many dollars are left on the table? Is it something that government should be worried about? So we contribute to this literature about the welfare significance of the lemons effect by looking at a particular market from a historical perspective. And our setting differs in many respects from previous literature. One of the differences is that we're going to investigate the question in a food market with plausibly endogenous quality. So what that means, in contrast to the insurance context or the initial used car market, is that we don't necessarily believe that quality is fixed. In fact, we know that wine growers and winemakers can do a lot of things to change the quality of a product. So the welfare loss that we're interested in finding evidence of here is not so much that not enough product is sold in the market. In fact, you're going to see it's a big market. There's plenty of wine being exchanged, but the welfare loss is going to arise from the fact that this wine may not be of a sufficient quality. So the socially optimal quality level, we argue, is higher than the one realized in this market with asymmetric information. So our setting is the market for wine, the entire market for wine, between 1907 and 1969 in France. So it's not focusing just on the higher quality segment of the market, what we call the appellations, so the wines that are sold under the name of a region like Bordeaux or Champagne. All of our welfare loss measures are going to be expressed relative to the entire wine market. And at the time, the most of the wine exchange was ordinary wine, not appellation wine. It's different today, but at the time, it was only a small fraction. So it's important that you keep in mind that all the numbers you're going to see are relative to the entire market. One reason why we are interested in looking at the lemons issue in this setting, besides the fact, as you know, that wines are differentiated products, both horizontally and vertically, with widely varying selling prices, is the fact that in the middle of our study period, a pioneering law changed the informational setting by providing guarantees to buyers regarding wine quality, the quality of these appellation wines, and these guarantees did not exist prior to that law. So there is a discrete change in the policy environment and in the informational setting, and we're going to basically compare how the market works before and after that reform. So our hypothesis is that the law partially solved the lemons problem in the sense that individual wine growers were free riding on a region's long-standing reputation for wine quality in the years leading up to the reform. So for example, atomistic producers in the Bordeaux region were misusing the name Bordeaux by producing wines that did not meet the historical quality of Bordeaux wines. They were free riding on the reputation because of the atomistic nature of supply. So to provide supporting evidence for this hypothesis, we're going to correlate the average departmental wine price received by producers. So here, a department, you can think of it as a US county, to the share of vineyards in that county that became eligible for this new quality guarantee called Appellation d'origine contrôlée, or AOC in French. And this is the official label identifying these historical wine appellations like Bordeaux or Burgundy or Champagne after the reform in 1935. So it's very important for the welfare analysis that we observe price because we're going to use it as a measure of willingness to pay and to provide supporting rationale for why we think we can do that. Here you see two panels. On the left, you see the national output across a consistent set of counties over the period. And so what you see here, it's the production in hectoliters, is that the production is varying tremendously from year to year. It can be divided by more than 2 or doubled from one year to the next. And this is not due to planting decisions, which you see on the right-hand side, which moves quite smoothly over time. This is just due to weather shocks. So weather affects both the quantity and the quality of wines, and this is evidenced in these two panels. So the quantity is moving a lot from one year to the next, and so we're going to consider this market in a given year as one with a vertical supply that is shifting around about the quantity axis from one year to the next, and a downward sloping demand that is more stable than supply. There are secular changes in the demand structure for wine, but these are not driving these changes in quantity that you see on the left panel. So the contributions of our paper are as follows. First, we study the lemons problem in the market for consumption goods. So we move away from durables, which had been the focus of previous research, and insurance. And here in our setting, the seller has private information as opposed to the insurance setting. Second, we analyze adverse selection in endogenous quality provision rather than market participation. So we are not arguing that the market is too small, that people are keeping their wine in their cellars and not putting it on the market. What we're arguing is that the wine that is sold is not of sufficient quality. These wine growers are not engaging in quality enhancing practices in a socially optimal way due to asymmetric information and free riding. Another contribution is that another difference is that we analyze an entire market, and the departmental price is representative of thousands of firms. For example, in the Bordeaux region, I think in the midpoint of our period, there were about 50,000 wine growers. So, there were millions of producers across France. And from an identification standpoint, we're going to rely on a plausibly exogenous change in the informational setting. So in that respect, we are close to the paper by Jean and Leslie on restaurant hygiene in the LA region. They also exploit a discrete change in policy, but unlike this paper, we do observe price, and so we're going to be able to make welfare claims. So for those of you who may not be completely familiar with the concept of AOC, Appellation d'origine contrôlée, it is a product, the substantial qualities of which can be attributed to the geographical region where the product is made, but the origin is not all there is. There is also a human factor, and as I said earlier, wine growers and winemakers can affect the quality of the product, and therefore, with an AOC and with a given region comes a set of technical requirements. So products claiming an appellation must abide by these, an AOC, sorry, must abide by these requirements, and they are subject to official control. So it's a rule with teeth, if you want. The product generally bears the name of the region of origin, for example, Bordeaux, but there could be also, these are regional appellations, Bordeaux, Burgundy, or Champagne, but there are sub-appellations as well within these regions for more prestigious wines. I'm going to show you an example in a following slide. And once an AOC is granted, producers from outside the region or producers who do not follow the production requirements cannot market their product under the region's name. So if you're in the Bordeaux region, but you don't want to plant the varietals that are approved, you can still produce wine, of course, but you cannot call it Bordeaux. You have to sell it in the ordinary wine market. Or you can call it something else, but not Bordeaux. So here's an example of a very famous and expensive Bordeaux. It's a Pauillac, which is a sub-appellation of Haut-Médoc, a sub-region of Bordeaux. So you see the village on the left, and then a label that I found on eBay on the right from 1966. So it's within our period of interest. And you see in the middle of the label, it says Appellation Pauillac Contrôlée. So that's the indication that this wine was produced according to the production requirements from the Pauillac appellation. And it's coming from vineyards that are eligible because of their soil and their climate for this particular appellation. So empirically, we're going to do something pretty simple. We're going to regress price on a regressor that captures eligibility under this AOC scheme. So we have log price on the left-hand side, where I denotes a county or a department and T a year. We have a county fixed effect. We have time effects, so year effects that are differentiated by broad wine region. I'm going to show you the regions so you can see. These are fine regions. The dashed areas do not produce wine, but all of the other counties do. And there are about 5-6 counties maximum per wine region. So these are fine, geographically differentiated time effects, the gamma RTs. Then SIT is our regressor of interest. It's the share of vineyards in that county and that year that is eligible for AOC. So AOCs are based on very fine delineations that depend on the geology and soils. And so we use the share of vineyards eligible for AOC as the regressor of interest. So this is going to be interpreted as an intention to treat, because obviously not every acre that is eligible is going to elect to produce AOC wine. And then the X vector is a vector of output controls at the county level. So production in that year or production lagged by 1 year, because wine can be aged in cellars before being put on the market. So given this regression equation, our identifying assumption is that within a region and a year, and conditional on quantity produced in that region, in that county and that year, there are no unobserved determinants of the average wine price that are correlated with the AOC status. And just to reinforce, this share eligible is going to be 0 for the first half, basically, of the period, and start to grow, at least for those counties that have some area eligible afterwards in the second half. So to implement this strategy, there is quite a bit of data work that is needed. There are two main different parts to that work. The first is gathering historical data on producer price and production, and also acreage and yield. You're going to see regression, ancillary regressions I'm going to show you later on that use acreage and yield. And this is from France's statistical yearbook, which is for the most part in print and not in digital form. And the second set of data is used to construct the regressor of interest, the share eligible. We construct it using legal documents, so the AOC decrees that are taken to implement the law from 1935 that specify eligible municipalities and date of recognition. As I said, the actual area eligible is based on geography, and so we use explicit polygon files that are provided by the French government that provide delineation for each AOC. So this is at the sub-municipality level based on the parcel, and even sometimes on the sub-parcel. So a given parcel could have a part of it that is eligible, but another part that is excluded either for soil or other reasons. And this is this very fine delineation that we try to use. And finally, we also cross these polygon files with satellite images that indicate the locations of vineyards in a land use raster file. The reason being that a given part of a plot could be eligible, but could be planted in something else, like a part of a forest, or there could be buildings on it or an access road. And so we want to eliminate that from the area. So here's what this leads us to doing for still the Pauillac AOC. So we have about, I think, 300 different AOCs that we track during our period, and Pauillac is one of them. It's located in the Bordeaux region. So there's a little blue dot here in Gironde, the department where Bordeaux is located. This dot then is being blown up in the other panels. So in red here, you see the location of the vineyards. So this is based again on the land use file, which is a raster file. And then in blue, this is a pixelization of the area eligible. So you see that indeed you have pixels that are eligible that are not grown in vineyards. So by overlaying the two, we are able to further refine our measure of the share of vineyards eligible for AOC in a given county in a given year. So here's one way to visualize the data, at least at the national level. So on the left panel, you see the cumulative distribution for eligible acreage. So it's rising quite fast. So within a couple of years, a lot of the area is defined. Below that black curve, you see a gray curve that is the number of AOC. So it lies mostly below. So it means that the biggest areas were defined first. And then as we move on, more decrees are adopted to define further areas, but these are sub-regions or smaller appellations that cover less area. And so that explains the relative positions of these two CDFs. And then on the right-hand side, you see again the same black curve, but this time expressed in terms of the percentage of total vineyard area in France. So what you see is that by the end of the period, about 32% of the area was eligible for AOC. And then below you have the take-up of the certification. So as I said, not every acre eligible actually decides to produce AOC wine, and you see that with the AOC production and the AOC acreage. So the AOC acreage is the little diamonds, and what you see is about half of the area eligible is actually grown in AOC wine. It's growing over time. And for production, the share is a little lower, suggesting that these are wines that have lower yield compared to the ordinary wines. And you also see that there's more fluctuations, which again is coming from weather fluctuations, because these affect the quantity and the quality of wines. So here are the main results from the price regression over the entire period. We use different subsamples in the paper, but I can't show you all the robustness checks here. Each column corresponds to a different way to control for output. So in the very last column, we don't control for production at all. In the first 4 columns, we control for production in the current year or in the previous year, and we allow the coefficient to vary or not by wine region. So our preferred column is column 3, but it really doesn't matter that much because the numbers are very close. And the coefficient on the AOC share is about 0.42, which means that going from 0% eligible to 100% eligible raises the average producer price of wine by 42%. So it's a big average effect. And some counties did see an increase up to 100%. For example, in the Gironde, where Bordeaux is produced, almost all of the acreage, or if not all of it, became eligible. So this is an intention to treat again, because not every acre eligible chooses to produce AOC wines. But this intention to treat effect is the effect that is of interest to us. So are these price effects spurious? Evidently, treated departments are not the same as control departments. Treated departments are the departments in which the government decided, it was decided. I don't have time to explain the eligibility process in detail, but let's say the government decided that the wines would be of sufficient quality to warrant the denomination. So, and this is not the case in departments that were not eligible. So these departments could have been on a different price trajectory, irrespective of AOC recognition. Keep in mind that we have spatially differentiated year fixed effects, which partially, but not completely, allay this concern. We offer additional pieces of evidence in support of this comparability assumption between treated and untreated departments. So I can't cover all of them, but I'm covering what I think are the most convincing of these additional pieces of evidence. The first one is a set of placebo results where we pretend that the reform happened 15, 20, or 10 years earlier than it actually did. So we just shift the time and pretend that the reform happened earlier. So we use kind of the long time series that we have at our disposal. And what we see when we run this placebo test is that the coefficient on the AOC share completely disappears. And becomes even negative, and depending on which standard error we look at, is significant in the case where we anticipate the reform by 10 years, but it's negative, so the sign is reversed. So it doesn't seem like departments that ultimately became eligible were on a higher price trajectory prior to the reform. The second piece of evidence I'd like to show is an event study. So you all know what that is, so I'm not going to comment more. I'm just going to let you look at the graph here. There is one thing that I should say is how we define the treatment date, because a department is not either treated or untreated. They are untreated prior to the reform, but after the reform, the share eligible grows over time. what we do is we define the treatment period different ways. I think in our preferred way, we say as soon as the eligible share reaches 25% of its value at the end of the period, we consider the department to be treated. And in robustness checks, we change that threshold to 50%. Yeah, I think that's what we do. The picture looks pretty much the same. So what you see here is that there seems to be no prior pre-trends in price prior to treatment. So hopefully I've managed to convince you that price rose due to eligibility. Now, does that mean that wine quality increased? Not necessarily. We have to be worried about quantity effects. Granted, we already have quantity as a control, but just to reinforce our belief in the quality effect, we can run regressions of acreage, yield, or output on the AOC share. And what we see is that, if anything, AOC recognition increased wine output, did not decrease it. So the increase in price that we see is not due to a movement along the demand curve at the department level due to the fact that production has been tightened. This is not a story about restricting output, implementing quotas, cartelization of the market at all. The second thing we need to be worried about is the reshuffling of wines across market segments. And this has to do with the fact that after the reform, a substantial part of wines that used to be sold under appellation names like Bordeaux or Burgundy could no longer claim the name and decided not to claim it anymore. And so they were redirected into the ordinary wine market. So these wines in a way were declassified, reshuffled. And this movement alone of wines from one segment of the market to another could potentially lead to changes in the price, even if the quality of these wines did not change. So we could have a situation where the product that is on the market doesn't change, it's just the segment changes, the label changes, and we have a price effect. So to investigate whether this is potentially driving our result on the main price effect, what we do is we remove all the departments in which we see a decrease in the total share of wines sold under appellation between the pre and post-treatment period, because we think that if we see a decline in the share of wine sold under appellation, this could be a sign of declassification, of this reshuffling effect. And this leads us to cut the sample by a lot, more than half. And what you see here in this table is that actually the effect is higher when you remove these departments with plausible reshuffling. So for example, on the entire period, the 0.42 here is our prior estimate that I already showed. And if we remove the departments that saw a decline in the share of wine sold under appellation, we have an even higher effect. Same thing if we focus on the period from 1916 to 1955. So we use these results to rule out the fact that the price effect is due to the reshuffling of wines rather than actual changes in the quality. So the last piece of the puzzle, and I apologize, I'm gonna have to be quick on that, is what about the costs, right? There is a welfare gain from producing higher quality wine. And if we combine our 42% increase with the ultimate share eligible, we obtain a 13% increase in what we call the market value, which constitutes a lower bound to the benefit to consumers, if you will. But there is an increase in cost because this quality is not free. As Elinor said at the outset, if farmers could do it for free, they would have done it already. So there is a cost to quality, and that's what drives the lemons effect. And so we're going to try to measure this cost by using a revealed preference approach. And again, I apologize, I'm going to have to be quick. But what we do is we don't have the luxury of using county level data for that, because we're going to regress the share of AOC acreage out of eligible acreage, the share that was grown under AOC, on a measure of the price premium for AOC wine, just to get a supply curve and integrate it to get the costs, right? So it's a revealed preference approach. And we don't have, the only information we have about AOC acreage, so not true AOC acreage, not eligible acreage, is at the national level. So these were national surveys, and they didn't go down to the department level. So we're working now with national data. We're going to regress the share, again, the share of acres enrolled out of acres eligible on a measure of the price premium. There are obvious simultaneity issues here. So we're going to instrument for the price premium using national income per capita, which was a very big driver of demand during the period, because especially post-war, national per capita income rose tremendously. And so we use that as a demand side instrument to instrument for the price and identify the supply curve. And so by combining our results on the price effect and this revealed preference approach, and I'm going to have to skip that slide, we're able to find a lower bound on the net welfare effect, which is expressed relative to the total market value, inclusive of all wines, of 7%. So we start from a 13% on the gross welfare effect. By the time we account for the cost, we divide that by half. We still have at least a 7% increase in total market value due to this reform, which is pretty large, especially when you consider that during the period, appellation wines were not as prevalent as they are today. So even changes on the very high end of the market can have very significant net welfare effects in the entire market for wine. So I'm going to stop here, and I thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you, Pierre. We do have about 13 minutes before they're going to cut off the webinar. So plenty of time for questions for Pierre or anybody else. But I'm going to take a moment just to thank everybody for participating today in the audience, or our presenters and co-authors. It was really a treat to be able to organize this session, and I've gotten a lot out of the feedback from the folks who are participating personally, and we all look forward to more feedback. So please let us all know, and especially let's use the rest of the time to talk about Pierre's paper. Thank you.
Thanks, John, for organizing the session too. This was great.
There are only 4 listeners left.
I see there are still some participants. 4, 3, 2. I shouldn't have said that.
I guess this is just thinking about, extensions of this paper and where one might go with it next. So you were looking at a period up until basically like the mid-1960s or so. What do you think about like the role of these types of certifications now and how they might interact with all of the other types of information we have available about attributes of otherwise what might seem like hard to observe the attributes of those particular goods, or goods that have characteristics that are hard to see otherwise?
So I'm glad Emmanuel has joined. Hopefully he can jump on that, because he knows the contemporary market for wine much better than I do. He did his thesis on Bordeaux wines. But so
hi everyone.
You're right, Elinor. There is obviously way more information accessible to consumers today than historically period. So not everything we say in the paper, we don't want to, say, oh, this is great and the system is great, because the market today is completely different. I think more than, Emmanuel, more than half of all wine produced today is AOC, right?
I would say half is a good guess.
Yeah, half. So during the period is 15%. So we are in a totally different situations. We have new AOCs. So the initial model was meant to preserve the names of historically famous wines like Champagne and Bordeaux, but the system today has evolved in a different direction. First of all, it applies to many products, not just wines. Second of all, you can make up a new AOC. These are, European rules now. This is not about preserving heritage anymore. It's about creating rents for producers. So if you come up with a good recipe and you want to trademark it, this is basically a system that is at the disposal of European farmers or wine growers to do that. So there is a proliferation of AOC. So just the sheer numbers of regional names has increased tremendously. Some may say that the quality is not always there, which not only impacts the wines that claim a name that people know is not very good, but it also calls into question the sensitivity of the entire system. If we continue to see all these brands, these regional brands, and the quality is not there, even the good students in the class are suffering from that. I think the system is not working or not working as it was intended to work. That's my personal opinion. But again, I'm not a specialist of the contemporary wine market. So Emmanuel, if you have something else to I'm happy to.
I guess one of the causes is that so in some regions, like for instance in the Bordeaux region where I'm from, AOC wine is now represents about 90% of the wine that is produced. So it's no longer a luxury good, it's just a common Bordeaux wine produced in the region. And I guess what no one really anticipated back in the 30s is that the national demand for wine really went down from the 40s on, and it decreased the demand for cheap wine. So the only wine that is left, I suppose that part of the story is that the demand decreased dramatically in France. That partly explains how well the supply reshaped in terms of proportions. And yeah, the
competition from other wine producing countries too, right? So I think the way that France wanted to react to new wines from the New World was to improve quality, and one easy way to do that was to claim more appellations, just to differentiate themselves.
What share of non-AOC wine is exported? I'd assume it's close to zero.
Yeah, it's very small. I think
Yeah.
most wines that is exported is the higher quality. But
Right.
That's a good question though, because I think even the non-AOC wine can claim to be produced in France. So I don't know if the label, the only French wine label could be a selling point for exports. Some cases.
I know in the US you can see wine that is from France that is not AOC wines. First of all, you have IGP, so you have lower grades if you want. That can be, but that are also quality wines that are exported. And then I think you also have table wines. But what you won't see probably is, bulk French wine being exported and then mixed with wines from other regions to produce Franzia or something like that. I don't think that this is something that is going on.
I'm a bit curious if this kind of like broad trend in quality improvement, could AOC basically be identifying the regions that the government, and maybe this is getting into the kind of how is the AOC actually assigned that you kind of wanted to not get into too much of the weeds, but is there potential that that's identifying the regions that have the greatest opportunity for quality improvements? I'm guessing it's actually identifying the regions that already have the highest performance to begin with, but I'm curious if you could kind of reflect on how that process maybe affects the identification assumptions.
Yeah, this is a common critique or comment we've gotten from referees. And I think, yeah, giving more institutional details helps with that. I mean, the thing is, if you look at the data in the pre-reform period, there is nothing that tells you, which departments are the good ones, because the prices not only move together, but the average levels of prices between what departments that will ultimately become treated and departments that will ultimately not be treated are actually very close to each other. So if there is potential, it's not really showing up in the pre-reform period data. Another response to that is, so the institution itself. So how does the government determine whether an AOC is worthy of or name is worthy of recognition? So it's coming from the producers, so they have to submit an application. So when I said the government decides, that was a bad shortcut. It's actually a bottom-up approach where the producer groups decide whether they want to send an application, and then they're asked to provide information on geology, varietals that are typically used, but there is nothing on prices. The only economic element that was asked to be part of the application was the marketing channels, but nothing about prices. So it seems very unlikely to us that prices could be considered by the government when ultimately deciding whether to grant the AOC, because that was not even part of the application process. And if you look at the timing of the recognitions, because obviously, they did not recognize 300 AOCs at once, it took several years, you see that there is a variety of AOCs being recognized at any point in time. So you have very broad AOCs together with small prestigious AOCs, together with small unknown AOCs. It seems like there is no real pattern. And so we really don't think that the timing of the recognition had anything to do with the counterfactual price trajectory that these departments were on. But this is a very fair question, yeah.
I think I would also add that the treaty department indeed had the better potential for quality, and that was the point of the law. So what we measure here is that the average, treatment effect on the treated, and not like if the government had created AOC in other regions, it would have had no effect, we assume, because they had no potential for quality. So it's not something that yeah. So obviously the treated department differed from the non-treated department, but that was the condition of success, which is kind of maybe unusual in treatment effect analysis.
Yeah, basically our numbers mean we're saying what the treated departments would have done if not for the recognition. And we're basing that on the fact that we do have parallel trends in the 30 or so years prior to the reform. They're moving together. And so we're, assuming that they would have moved together after, if not for the reform, that's these, 13% or 7%, that's the effect of the reform. But we're not saying, if you treat some random county in a region that has no potential, then there will be a 7% increase in welfare. That's not what we're saying.
And did you all look at any heterogeneity in the impacts across kind of the different, you were mentioning the differences in AOCs. Oh, I guess this is going to end, so maybe I'll take it offline.
Yeah, we did. We did it by broad wine regions. I think we chopped it in 4 or 5 different regions, and there was heterogeneity indeed. So in one region, I think we found 0 effect. In the Southwest, at least during the period, and in all the others, we had positive effects.
Mostly Burgundy. I think most Burgundy and Champagne mostly, I think.
So we're going to
All
be
right.
cut off. Is that,
They're about to turn us off. They're about to just
Yeah,
end the session.
at 45.
Well, thanks again.
Thanks everyone, and thanks.
Thank you.
Hope you all have a very, very good, happy 2021.
Yes.
Thank you, you too.
Thanks,
Bye.
John. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.